She never planned to write any of it down. For 30 years, she showed up. Ward after ward, patient after patient, hand after hand held in the particular darkness of the hours when people slip from one side of life to the other. She changed medications and adjusted pillows and spoke quietly to people whose families had gone home for the night and who needed someone to simply be present in the room with them while they finished the work of dying. She did not think of herself as a collector of wisdom. She was a nurse. She was doing her job. She was taking care of people. But something happens when you spend 3 decades in that proximity to the end of things. Something accumulates that has no clinical name. You begin to hear patterns in what people say when there is nothing left to say except what is true. When the performance is over and the pretending is done, and the image people spent their entire lives carefully constructing has become irrelevant, because the only audience left is a nurse on the night shift and whatever comes next. She told me that what surprised her most across all those years, across all those different people from all those different lives, the wealthy ones and the struggling ones, the ones surrounded by family and the ones who died with only her in the room, was how similar the final conversations became. Not identical. People are never identical, but similar in the way that matters. Similar in the things they wished for, similar in the things they regretted, similar in what they wanted in their last coherent hours to make sure someone still living understood. These are 5 of those things, not the clinical observations of a medical professional, though she has those too, the human ones, the ones she carried home on the nights that would not let her sleep. The ones she eventually wrote down not because she thought anyone would publish them, but because she needed somewhere to put them that was not just inside her own chest. I want to share them with you today because I believe they belong to anyone who still has time to use them. And if you are listening to this, that means you. The first thing dying patients told her, more consistently than almost anything else across 30 years of final conversations, was this: I spent too much of my life waiting to feel ready. She described a man she cared for during her years at a hospital in the Pacific Northwest, a retired civil engineer who had spent his career building bridges, which she always found quietly meaningful in retrospect. He had a list. She did not know about the list until his 2nd week under her care, when his daughter mentioned it almost in passing, a list he had kept in a leather notebook since his late 30s of things he intended to do once he felt adequately prepared to do them. He pulled the notebook out one evening and showed it to her. She said it was not a bucket list in the cheerful Instagram sense that phrase has come to carry. It was specific, practical, a trip to Portugal he had researched in detail, a letter to his estranged brother whose address he had looked up and written inside the front cover, a conversation with his youngest son about something that had happened between them 20 years earlier and had never been addressed, a painting class he had registered for twice and withdrawn from twice because he did not feel he had enough natural talent to justify the time. None of it had happened. Not the Portugal, not the letter, not the conversation, not the painting class. She asked him gently what he had been waiting for. He thought about it for a long time, and then he said something she wrote down that same night. He said, "I kept waiting to become the version of me who was ready. And that version never showed up. I think I was already him the whole time." Readiness is one of the great deceptions of a long life. It presents itself as a reasonable prerequisite. You would do the thing, you would make the call, you would begin. If only you were a little more certain, a little more prepared, a little further along in the becoming. And meanwhile the notebook fills up, and the years empty out, and the version of you who was ready was already standing there the entire time, waiting to be recognized. You do not need to become someone else before you begin. You are already the someone else you were waiting for. Begin with that person. Begin now. The second thing her patients told her, and this one landed differently because of how quietly it was always delivered, never with anger, always with a kind of exhausted clarity, was, I gave too many years to people who were never going to give them back. She was careful in how she shared this with me because she did not want it to be heard as a cynical thing. It was not cynical in the mouths of the people who said it. It was said with a kind of sorrow that is only available to someone looking backward across the full length of a life, seeing the distribution of their energy with the honesty that proximity to death tends to produce. What they meant, in almost every case, was not that they regretted loving. They did not regret love. What they regretted was the specific, identifiable expenditure of decades on relationships that were fundamentally extractive, on people who received without reciprocating, on family members who took their loyalty for granted, on friendships that were maintained entirely by their own effort and that would have dissolved the moment that effort stopped, on employers and institutions and causes that consumed their best years and returned nothing of equivalent value. Bronnie Ware, the Australian palliative care nurse whose book The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying became one of the most widely read explorations of end-of-life reflection ever published, documented this pattern extensively across her own years of work. What she found, consistent with what this nurse found, was that the regret was almost never about having loved too freely. It was about having given the most irreplaceable thing, time, to people and institutions that never truly valued it. After 65, this becomes the most urgent possible question, not because the years behind you cannot be recovered, they cannot, and making peace with that is its own important work, but because the years ahead of you are still yours to allocate. The people in your life right now are either filling you or emptying you. The relationships you maintain are either reciprocal or they are not, and you are old enough now to know the difference clearly. You have always known the difference. The only question is whether you will finally let that knowledge change what you do. Give your remaining time to people who would grieve its absence. Everyone else has already received more than enough. The third thing her patients told her was the one that stopped her, she said, the first time she heard it. Because she had expected, going into that work, that people at the end of life would express regret about what they had failed to achieve, the career that had not reached its potential, the business that had not succeeded, the ambitions that had run up against the limits of circumstance or luck or time. What they actually said was almost the opposite. What they said, what she heard in dozens of variations across 30 years, was, "I wish I had let myself be happier." Not more successful, not more accomplished, not more anything that the external world would measure and recognize. Simply happier, more present in the moments that were, in retrospect, the ones that actually counted. More willing to receive the joy that was available in ordinary days without mentally deferring it to a future version of their life that felt more deserving of happiness than the version they were actually living. She described a woman in her mid-80s who had raised 4 children, maintained a beautiful home, and kept an immaculate garden throughout the decades of a long and outwardly comfortable life. By every visible measure, this woman had lived well, and yet what she told the nurse in her final weeks was that she had spent most of her conscious existence in a state of low-grade anticipatory worry that had prevented her from fully inhabiting any of the good things while they were present. She worried when her children were young that something would happen to them. When they were teenagers, she worried about the choices they would make. When they were grown, she worried about their marriages and their finances and their health. When the grandchildren arrived, the worry simply transferred seamlessly to the next generation. And she said, with the particular clarity that seemed to come to people in those final weeks, she said that she had been present for a beautiful life and had spent most of it in the future, where the feared things lived, rather than in the present, where the actual life was happening. The research behind this is not simply anecdotal. Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard, using real-time experience sampling data from tens of thousands of participants, found that the human mind spends nearly half its waking hours thinking about something other than what it is currently doing, and that this mind-wandering, regardless of what positive content it involves, consistently predicts lower happiness than being present to even mundane current experience. You have permission to be happy now, not when things are more settled, not when the worry resolves, not when you finally feel you have earned it. now, in the ordinary, imperfect, fully available present moment. That permission was always yours. The only question was whether you were going to use it before the window closed. Use it. The fourth thing her patients told her was the one she found hardest to hear because it implicated her, and it implicates most of us, and it is true anyway. What they said was, I should have said it, while I still could, not the dramatic deathbed confession, not some concealed secret, just the ordinary, everyday things that people mean to say to the people they love, and somehow, through busyness, through the assumption that there will be more time, through the particular emotional awkwardness that surrounds direct expression of love and gratitude and apology in families that never learned a comfortable language for it, never quite say. She told me about a man in his late 70s, a former high school football coach from a small town in rural Georgia, who asked her on his third night in her care whether she could help him write a letter. His hands were no longer reliable enough to write it himself. She sat with him for the better part of 2 hours while he dictated it to her. It was addressed to his son, who was 53 years old, and who, by the coach's own account, had heard his father say, I am proud of you approximately twice in the course of a lifetime. Not because the father was not proud. He was, in the aching, inarticulate way that certain men of certain generations carry enormous love inside a vocabulary that was never given the words to express it. He had simply assumed for 50 years that his son knew, that it was somehow visible in the way a man who loves his child shows up year after year to the games and the graduations and the grandchildren's birthdays, that the saying of it was redundant to the showing of it. His son did not know. Not with the kind of certainty that hearing it out loud provides, and so they wrote the letter together, the retired coach and the nurse on the night shift, and she folded it and sealed it and put it in the drawer of his bedside table with his son's name on the front. She does not know if it was ever read. She hopes so. If there is a person in your life who does not know, with the unmistakable clarity of having been told directly that you love them, that they changed something for you, that their presence in your life was not incidental, but essential, tell them. Not in the complicated, emotionally hedged, half-expressed way that feels safer. Directly. In words plain enough that there will be no misunderstanding and no need for a retired nurse to help write the letter later. The words do not need to be eloquent. They need to be said. The fifth thing, the last thing, and the one she told me she still carries with her years after leaving clinical practice, was not a regret at all. Every pattern she described up to this point was something people wished they had done differently. This one was different. This one was something people said with the particular piece of someone who had finally, in the last chapter, gotten something right. What they said was, in the end, it was always the small things. Not the achievements, not the milestones, not the vacations they could afford, or the house they managed to pay off, or the career that had brought recognition. At the end of the accounting, when the mind goes back through everything and finds what actually mattered, what actually held weight, what actually produced the sustained warmth of a life well lived, it was almost never the things that had seemed most important while they were happening. It was the Tuesday morning when the light came through the kitchen window at a certain angle, and someone they loved was sitting across the table. It was the sound of rain on a roof during a particular conversation that went nowhere and covered nothing important and lasted until midnight. It was the ordinary weekend afternoon that held nothing remarkable and was therefore never photographed or written down or commemorated in any way, but that the mind, at the end of everything, returns to, like a compass finding north. She said that what struck her most about this, heard across hundreds of conversations over 3 decades, was not the content of the specific memories. It was the consistency with which they were small, with which the things that mattered most were things that would have been invisible to anyone watching from the outside, things that required no money, no status, no achievement, no perfect conditions, things that were available in an ordinary life on an ordinary day to anyone paying enough attention to receive them. The psychologist and Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, who spent his career studying how human beings experience and remember their own lives, made a distinction that applies directly here between the experiencing self, who lives in the present moment, and the remembering self, who constructs a narrative of a life in retrospect. His research found that the remembering self is often a poor historian of actual joy, that we systematically underweight ordinary pleasures while they are occurring and overweight them in retrospect, that we pursue the milestone while barely noticing the Tuesday morning, that we plan the vacation while failing to fully inhabit the afternoon. The dying patients were telling her something that psychology would eventually confirm in peer-reviewed journals. The small things were not small. They were the life. They were the actual content of the one thing that was never going to be retrievable once it was gone. And most people did not fully understand that until they could see all of it at once, from the particular vantage point of the end of things. And the small moments suddenly resolved into focus like a photograph finally finding its sharpness. So here is what she carried out of 30 years in those rooms. 5 things, spoken by hundreds of different people in hundreds of different ways, that distilled down to the same essential instruction. Stop waiting until you feel ready. You are ready. Begin now. Give your time only to people who value it as the irreplaceable thing it is. Let yourself be happy before you have finished earning it. Say the true things out loud to the people they belong to, and pay close enough attention to your ordinary days that the Tuesday morning light through the kitchen window lands on you with its full and unhurried weight. None of these things require the end to be visible before they make sense. That is precisely the point. The patients who told her these things were not sharing them as wisdom they had successfully applied. They were sharing them as wisdom they wished they had applied. They were handing it forward across the only distance that cannot be closed, to whoever still had the time to use it differently than they had. You have that time. Not infinitely, not guaranteed, but present, right now, in whatever the next hour of your life contains. The retired nurse spent 30 years learning this on behalf of people who no longer could. She carries it the way you carry something you were given that did not belong to the giver to keep. It was always meant to pass through. It was always meant to reach someone who could still do something with it. It has reached you now. Do something with it.